Okay, good afternoon, and welcome to all of you to the fourth annual Alvin Plantinga lecture. These lectures were started 3 years ago in an effort to allow our most senior fellow with the Center for Philosophy of Religion to share some of his work, some of his interests with a wide university audience. The lectures are not aimed simply at philosophers or theologians, but at the university as a whole. The Alvin Plantinga Fellow in the Center for Philosophy of Religion this year is Thomas Williams from the University of South Florida. Thomas previously taught at Creighton and at the University of Iowa after having received his PhD here at Notre Dame in 1994. Thomas is widely recognized as an expert in medieval philosophy and the history of ethics, and especially well known, I think it's fair to say, for his work on Scotus and Anselm. He's done an enormous amount of work in the 12 years since he left Notre Dame. He's edited 2 volumes, including the Cambridge Companion to Scotus, in which he has 2 papers. His work has appeared in many other places, including the Cambridge Companion to Augustine, the Cambridge Companion to Abelard, the Cambridge Companion to Anselm, and the Cambridge Companion to Medieval Philosophy. Okay, you might start to suspect that it's sort of hard to do a Cambridge Companion these days without including a paper from Thomas Williams in it. He's also published a number of translations, not with Cambridge, I might add, of many of Anselm's writings. And he's working on a reader which will include all of Anselm's philosophical and theological works. As the Alvin Plantinga Fellow with the Center this year, Thomas has been focusing on a book on Anselm, which he's writing with his frequent co-author on matters Anselmian, Sandra Visser. And this book is to be published by Oxford University Press. His topic for today, as you can see, is Unruly Wills and Defections, Anselm as Moral Theorist and Moral Advisor. After the talk and after discussion following the lecture, we will also have a reception in the lobby outside, so I do hope that all of you will stay for that as well. Please join me in welcoming Thomas Williams.
I would be remiss if I didn't begin by thanking all of you for being here and thanking the Center for giving me the opportunity to do some work that I would not otherwise have been able to do. Co-authoring a book with someone just down the toll road from here is rather different from co-authoring a book with someone who is a very long flight or 2 away. And while Western civilization would not have crumbled had this book on Anselm not been written, I hope that at least the work has been worth doing, and I very much appreciate the opportunity to do it, and particularly to have a fellowship named in honor of Alvin Plantinga. My own performance in Professor Plantinga's course that I took many years ago, I'm sure he has mercifully forgotten. It was not, perhaps, the highlight of my graduate student career, and certainly not the highlight of his illustrious career as a teacher, scholar, philosopher, and leader in Christian philosophy. Nonetheless, it is a great honor to be the Alvin Plantinga Fellow. I also wanted to say just a bit before I dive into the paper about the choice of topic. I was very mindful of what Tom just said about the need to present something that would be at least somewhat generally accessible. I may have gone a bit overboard. We'll see about that. But the ins and outs of, say, Anselm's theory of modality or his semantic theory, say, which I haven't worked out yet, seem to be a bit much. So I'm looking at his moral theory, which has some wonderful intersections with his life as a moral advisor, as a pastor, as a bishop, as an abbot, and so forth. So hence the choice of topic. And my co-author, Sandra Visser, is here to answer any questions that might arise over the course of the talk. So let me begin by talking about sort of what I'm going to talk about in that dreadful PowerPoint way. Give you a sort of outline of the talk so that you know where we're headed, what our roadmap is through the talk. The key moral concepts for Anselm are rectitude of will and justice. And rectitude, uprightness, rightness, correctness, translate it as you wish. But rectitude of will is really a key concept. And justice, another key concept, is defined in terms of rectitude of will. So our first job is to get clear on what rectitude of will is and what justice is. Both of those will be understood fundamentally in terms of what we ought to do. And that idea of what we ought to do raises some obvious problems, namely, what ought we to do? Concretely, how do we fill in or specify what it is that we ought to do? And there are sort of two ways of getting at that I'll pursue. One is to think about what we ought to do in terms of fulfilling our purpose, a sort of teleological notion that ought to be very popular and comfortable around here, although Anselm does some odd things with it, as he always does odd things with everything he touches. And a second, very dear to Anselm, is to think in terms not of fulfilling our purpose, but of finding our place in the universe perfectly ordered by God. So that's the question of concretely specifying or filling out what we ought to do. There's another question then about how we know what we ought to do. And a further question still about what ought to be the motivation for acting in the way that we ought to act. And questions about moral motivation will tie in very nicely with his understanding of justice as a virtue in particular, something like a virtue, and with charity. So that's our agenda for today. If there are any real medievalists in the crowd, I acknowledge that some of my images have a dubious provenance. Some of them are not from the right century or the right part of Europe or whatever. I know all of this. I'm a good enough historian to be bothered by that, and a bad enough historian not to be so bothered by it that I just don't do it. This, however, is at least an appropriate image. It's from the right period. It's an incipit to the Monologion and Proslogion, and I think serves nicely for the beginning. Anselm emphasizes throughout his work, his dialogue on truth, De Veritate, that to ascribe rectitude, our key moral concept, to creatures, is to say that they are doing what they ought to do. And there are a couple of ways of fleshing this out. We can say that they fulfill God's purpose for them. We can say that they are subject to God's will. But what distinguishes rational creatures from just any old created thing is that rational creatures are capable of doing what they ought to do freely. That is, they're capable of acting on the basis of will to fulfill God's purposes, to take up their proper place in the divine ordering, or however you like to put that. Since we fulfill God's purposes through the freedom of the will, we have rectitude, we rational creatures, when and only when we have rectitude of will. So for the rational creature, rectitude is rectitude of will. As Anselm puts it, no one else is understood to be upright, rectus, but those who have an upright will. Now we connect the notion of rectitude of will with justice and moral evaluation. There's a nice bit of byplay in De Veritate where Anselm, designated as teacher, and the unnamed bonehead designated as student, have a discussion like this. Anselm says, okay, rectitude, justice, same thing. And the student says, now wait a minute, that can't be right. Because you've already said that rectitude is a matter of doing what things ought to do. So say that I drop a stone and the stone falls to the earth, that's what the stone ought to do. That's the way God has set things up. We don't want to call the stone just, do we? And Anselm, in his usual way, says, sure, I don't see why not. The stone is just. And the student says, well, but wait a second. We associate justice with moral evaluation. To call someone just is to say more than just that that person is doing what he or she ought to do, right? It's to praise the person, it's to evaluate the person's activity in a certain way. And we don't want to call the stone just in that sense. And Anselm says, okay, here's the difference. The stone does what it ought to do because of the necessity imposed upon it by God's creation. A just person does what he or she ought to do because of the free choice of the will. But that is a matter of justice only when the person is doing what is right as a result of being A, aware that it's right, and B, choosing it because it's right. Or in his preferred formulation, justice is rectitude of will preserved for its own sake. Or justice is rectitude of will preserved for the sake of that rectitude itself. Propter ipsam rectitudinem. Every will, he says, has both a what and a why. And justice is as much a matter, or perhaps even more a matter of the why. What we ought to will is clear. He says we ought to will what we ought to will. We ought to will what God wants us to will. We ought to will to maintain our proper place in God's creation. We ought to will to fulfill God's purposes. Why we ought to will it, however, is equally clear. We ought to will what we ought to will because we ought to will it. And so justice is rectitude of will, preserved for the sake of that rectitude itself. Now, as I've said, there are a couple of ways of specifying now, or concretely filling out, what it is that we ought to do. And the first sort of path goes through thinking about our purpose. What we ought to do is fulfill our purpose. And how do we get at that? Well, this is one of the most interesting and most characteristic moves in Anselm's moral theory. We start there's a great place at one point where an interlocutor says, start from a long way back. You don't really have to tell Anselm to start from a long way back, because he always starts from a long way back. So get ready. We're starting from a way long way back. Trinitarian theology. We're plugging along in the Monologion very nicely, and all these truths about God's triune nature are coming forth. And Anselm exclaims, I can't wrap my mind around this being. This being is ineffable. This being surpasses human understanding. But wait, how can that be, given that I've just had all these wonderful, sound, and obviously compelling arguments to the effect that this being is of a sort that I now say I can't understand? Well, his meditations on this are alluding constantly to this passage. I've quoted scripture generally from the authorized version of 1611 just because that's what I like to do. And in this case, it's also important to have the Latin. This is the Vulgate. This is, or at least the version of the text that Anselm would have known. For now we see through a glass darkly, or videmus nunc per speculum in enigmata. And Anselm uses this text in a wonderfully subtle way to reflect on how it can be that we know this unknowable God and speak this ineffable God. So the in enigmata part, riddlingly, figuratively, more or less, forms or leads him into a certain semantic view, which is outside our interest for now. But the per speculum part leads him into sort of epistemological views that are going to be relevant. What is the mirror, the glass of the King James Version, through which or in which we see God? It's the rational mind.